My final project was on the effects of various water sources on plant growth. And I was interested in this because I really love plants and I'm always wondering what kind of water is best for me to use. I work at Starbucks and they have reverse osmosis water, and I have people like fellow workers at Starbucks that swear by Starbucks water for their plants. And I really wanted to know, is that legit? Like, is reverse osmosis water really great for your plants? Um, or is something more natural like rainwater, spring water, or stream water going to be better for them? And so I kind of looked around and I found some sources about water quality. There's a lot of sources about contamination of water and how that impacts plant growth. There's not a whole lot that I could find in the scientific literature about effects of various kinds of water or water treatments on plant growth. I did see a lot of stuff about how geology can impact hardness of water, which we talked about in class, as well as the water treatment of it can impact the parameters in the water quality. Um, Especially when we're talking about hardness or dissolved ions and stuff like that. And so I did find a lot of literature about the kind of water that you should use for plants from non-scientific sources. So this was plant hobby websites. There's a lot of those recommending the kind of water for you to use for your plants. And then there was a couple educational science experiment websites, like running an experiment for children about figuring out what kind of water is best for plant growth. And there was a lot, and I mean a lot of sources from water filtration system websites. And these sources are probably all going to be pretty biased because they're trying to promote their own water filtration system. And so most of these suggested that filtered tap water was going to be the best for plants. Um, and since I didn't find a whole lot of research on it, I really was just spitballing for my hypothesis here. But I hypothesize that distilled and deionized water, we're going to have the least plant growth, and rain and stream water, we're going to have the most plant growth. So, like, the more natural sources would have the most, and the sources where we're taking out a lot of the stuff in the water was going to have the least plant growth. And so for my methods, I collected all of my water. I wanted to make sure that my rainwater was all collected at the same time as well as my stream water. So I made sure to get enough of it. I wasn't really sure how much I was going to use. So I have like literally 5 gallon buckets full of water. And then I also collected tap water, reverse osmosis water from Starbucks, deionized water from the chemistry building. And then I bought a bunch of waters from Kroger, including their drinking water, which is basically just filtered tap water, distilled water, and spring water, which is spring water, but it was also filtered. It didn't say that on the bottle, but usually bottled spring water is still filtered. I weighed out all my black beans to make sure that they were the same weight, and then I sorted out 10 of them for every kind of water, germinated them in water for 5 days. So that's kind of what you see here in this mason jar here. That's my beans germinating. And then after they had germinated for 5 days, I planted them all in pots of the same size using the same soil, and the same window with, like, I have artificial lights that I use. You can see them kind of in this picture here, to make sure that the light was about as even as I could make it. And then they were indoors to kind of control the temperature and humidity conditions. And so you can kind of see in this top picture here, this is them starting to grow. So I let them grow for 10 weeks. I cut them on Monday. So 2 days ago, I was exactly 10 weeks from when I planted them. And then here, this is them about partway through. And then after I cut them, I weighed them. I measured them in centimeters from how tall they were. I did not measure the roots because I was not really able to get the roots out of the dirt very well, instead of like they were mixed up with each other. So it was really hard for me to get the root length. So I just got the length of the plant, the mass of the plant, how many bean pods were growing on each plant, and then the bean pods themselves are usually too small for me to weigh by themselves, but I weighed all of them together for each type of water, and then did the average of bean pods, or the weight of bean pods. That is not on this poster, but I did do that. Um, and kind of what I found is a couple different things. So the first thing is that distilled water, only 5 of the beans actually grew into plants. And for every other thing, or every other water source, it was 8 or more. And so already we're seeing distilled water is probably not going to be the best choice for your plants. Down here, you can kind of see this is the height and pod number. So we have height in these green bars here, and spring water had the most, and then distilled water had the least. And this is the height, the average height of each plant. And so they're in order from the most to the least from left to right. And then the line on top is the average numbers of pods per plant. I thought that it would be useful to compare the number of pods with and like have that with the height so that you could kind of see how many pods they were having compared to the height, especially because these plants are not able to grow to full maturity. And you can kind of see here there's a couple that stand out that are lower in this overall trend here, because really this is like 10 centimeters different, less than 10 centimeters different here. And so they were all pretty close. 10 centimeters is pretty big. But overall, they kind of followed a trend, or they were all right around each other. And since I had different numbers of bean pods growing or a different number of plants growing, I couldn't really do a whole lot of statistics comparing each one. But you can kind of see here, reverse osmosis has the least number of pods, which is kind of interesting. And then distilled water, of course, has the least number of pods and the least growth. Rainwater didn't do too hot either. But compared to the actual height, reverse osmosis has less than expected, as well as distilled water. And so definitely we can say distilled water, according to my data, it was definitely not great. We have the same trend over here with mass. So the line on top of this one is mass, and distilled water and drinking water, filtered drinking water from Kroger, had the least amount of mass in there. But overall, it kind of follows this trend. So distilled water had the least of pretty much everything. It had the least of everything. So distilled water is the worst for plant growth. And then reverse osmosis over here, it was pretty good for actual growth of plants. You can see kind of here, like the mass was lower, but not outrageously low, and the height was pretty good, but the number of pods per plant dropped dramatically to less than 0.6 pods per plant. And so what this kind of tells me is that what I found from the unscientific literature, for a reason that might explain this, is that there's not a lot of nutrients in the water for reverse osmosis. And so they recommend putting fertilizer with your reverse osmosis water if you're using that for your plant growth. So while it was pretty good for plant growth, it really wasn't great for fruit. But overall, it wasn't terrible. And so here you can kind of see these are some flowers before they turn into pods on my bean plants. And then this is an example of some of the pods. So you can kind of see that some of them are huge and others of them are really, really small. And so that's why I had to weigh them all together. Overall, we can say that distilled water was the worst, and then spring and tap water did the best, which I expected the spring water, the bottled spring water, to do pretty well. I did not really expect the tap water to do too hot, but it did. It did better even than the reverse osmosis water that my coworkers swear by. So tap water was one of the best ones that I found, as well as that bottled spring water. Um, Overall, though, every one of these waters performed pretty evenly. I will say that reverse osmosis water resulted in the fastest growth of these plants. They sprouted first, they got leaves first, they germinated first. All of those happened first. So it did contribute to a more rapid growth. And then some potential sources of error here is that these plants were not allowed to complete their whole life cycle. They probably still had another about 2 weeks of growth into them, if not a little bit more than that. They usually grow for 12 to 14 weeks by the time they're done. So none of these bean pods were they weren't mature yet. I couldn't have eaten them. And so I think it would have been interesting to let this experiment go on for a little bit further. And then the light source, I did have a lot of problems with the light because my window doesn't distribute light super evenly. So if I were to repeat this in the future, I would probably put the plants not next to a window and instead have only artificial light to control that a little bit better. Yeah, these are my sources over here. Only one of these is a scientific source because, again, I really could not find a whole lot. And then the other ones is, like I was mentioning earlier, the water filtration websites, and then a science education website, as well as the plant hobby website. That's it. Thank you.